As I read your book and I look through it, when I first think about it, I'm like, wow, this is quite an undertaking, because let's face it, this is a group that if you ask 1,000 people, regular people, they would never think the people we see flying around in jets or working in high rises or being chauffeured around, that they have anything but a lovely life. But you have a little different twist on this. You've seen it from the inside. Can you tell us a little bit about what drove you to write your book and really do the research that you did?
You know, there's a background that I think is very important to why I came up with the book, which is earlier in my career, I did very different kind of work. And one of the things that I realized that has carried me through is the understanding that behind every story, there's a deeper story. So when I began to work with people coming from prominent business owning families, wealthy families, I realized that there was a culture around it. And that culture talked about entitled kids. It talked about trust fund babies. And it had a twist based upon the fear that families would lose what they had worked on because that's what was going to happen. But it didn't make sense to me. And it particularly didn't make sense to me when I would work with a family and I would see somebody called the next gen, could be 50 years old. Could be somebody like Henry Kaiser, who was 75 years old when we interviewed him and still felt like he was he had recalled being a member of the next gen, and how there was a view of him and a hope that someday he would be recognized. And I needed to take a look at what was behind that. What was the story behind the story? So I began to ask people, what is it like growing up in the land of giants?
Well, that's very interesting, because I was going to ask you, for us that don't live in that world, when you say the land of giants, like, what are you talking about?
When I talk about the land of giants, it's very interesting because, as I said, Rising Gen, when I interviewed them, didn't question what they meant. But they grew up and could tell stories about people who were before them. Could be the first generation, could be their parents, could be just several generations back. But it was always a story about somebody who had unusual accomplishments, who seemed to rise above what most people are able to do. And they were born into that world. And that story was the story behind the story for them.
When you talk about pressure, give me an idea of example of, like, when you say there's a lot of pressure, is it meaning, hey, I have to excel greater than my parents or the prominent family? Or is it just feeling like, hey, I just can't do this?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think for some, it's the feeling that they'll never live up, they'll never measure up. But for many who are even very accomplished, there's the question about what they've done. Is it enough? And I've walked into families where the next generation have law degrees, have started things, and still look at the difference between who they are and what they've done and what the world was before them.